And it's automatically recording, so everyone knows you are being recorded right now. In the interest of starting on time, I'm gonna get the Facebook Live going right now. Give me 1 second. Cool. It says it's preparing. Should be on here in a second for everyone. I'm expecting Geronimo here in a moment. Here he goes. Well, we should be live soon, and folks should be joining us here in a moment. Geronimo, welcome.
Hey, welcome. I mean, thank you. I'm changing my background.
There you go.
That better.
Excellent, excellent. And people should be joining here with us shortly. I'm gonna give them a couple of minutes. But while we wait, I wanted to give everyone a bit of an overview of our time together today. We're gonna, of course, start off with some introductions at a certain point. I'm gonna set the groundwork for kind of the context of our work together today. And then, of course, you guys received the questions I shared with you earlier, and we're going to go through as many of those questions we have. Then I'm going to make sure that we have at least about 10, 15 minutes for Q&A near the end. I'll make sure to give instructions to folks of how to do that and those kinds of things. But that's kind of what our time is going to be like today. And as a reminder, the three topics that we talked about are based off of the conversation from last week with Glenn Singleton. And those three recommendations that he had were to reflect on race in your life, seek other perspectives, and acknowledge and address your own biases. And so those are the things that we're going to be focusing on for the most part today. All right. And I'm going to give it a little bit more time just so we can give folks opportunity to join here and online. Cool. Well, I just want to say one, thank you for everyone here. I'm actually going to ask you here in a moment to do an introduction, but I want to say thank you for everyone who's been here today. We're going to go ahead and get started. Today is our first in a series of six webinars. There are follow-ups to the Path to Racial Equity, which is being put on by Sanders Wingo and the LBJ Foundation, focusing on race equity here in the Central Texas region. And we're collaborating with them, and we are the Central Texas Collective for Racial Equity. And we're just partnering with them to continue the conversation. And we're calling this segment, the After Show, because what we have done is ask folks, thought leaders in the community, to really focus and continue the dialogue about the topics that are being covered. And today's topic is focused on education. And so what I've asked are some of my friends and colleagues in this region, some big thought leaders in the space. And I'm actually going to have them introduce themselves here in a moment. But before we do introductions, what I want to do is kind of just set the tone. We are in a really unique situation right now. We're about to actually have the inauguration of our new president tomorrow, and I think in general that usually is not that big of a deal, depending on your political perspective. If it wasn't for the insurrection that we had last week at our Capitol, and so a lot of people are even here at the Capitol here in Texas and Austin, people are kind of on edge about people showing up with guns, and people are quite not sure, and they're feeling a lot of anxiety about where we're going as a country. And so I wanted to make sure to acknowledge that anxiety or uncertainty or frustration, whatever the feelings may be around that space, but also create the space that we are hopefully going to have here in this discussion, because I think this discussion about our experiences as educators and thought leaders, I think will be really critical and important for folks to hear as they're, really tackling some really big issues. We've been in the pandemic since, which feels like almost like a year. This started actually this time last year. We hadn't really hunkered down until around, I believe, March or so. But here we are still hunkered down, really trying to do our best. Our kids are having to do, for the most part, virtual experience and really make that adjustment. And so education looks very different today just than what it did last year. And so I think this will be a really critical conversation for us to have about how do we deal with not just the pandemic around COVID, but also the pandemic of racism that we've been really challenged to face for a number of reasons over the last several months. And so what I'd like to do is just do some, I'm gonna ask each of the individuals here to just do a brief introduction and just tell the audience a little bit about who you are and what you do here in the region. And I'm gonna ask Elizabeth Dickey, if you don't mind just introducing yourself first.
Thank you. I'm Elizabeth Dickey. I am the principal at the Rosedale School. We are a special campus in Austin ISD, and we serve students with multiple disabilities. We are a pre-K through age 21 program, and just really focused on helping students with disabilities figure out what life's going to be like once school's finished, and getting them ready, really focusing on communication, and also very focused on our connection with families.
Excellent. And then if you don't mind going, Dr. Gross from Manor ISD, could you introduce yourself? We'll catch her in a second. Geronimo, could you go next? You're the over at Austin ISD.
Sure. Geronimo Rodriguez. I serve as the president of the Austin Independent School District Board of Trustees, and glad to be here today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Geronimo. And Dr. Pierce Burnette, could you go next?
Thank you, because he gave. I'm Colette Pierce Burnette. I serve Huston Tillotson University as its president and CEO. We're a historically Black college here in Austin.
Excellent. And then Dr. Garcia.
Thank you, Dr. Prince. I'm Dr. Liz Garcia. I do a few things in the area. I coach quite a few principals across the state of Texas. I do quite a bit of leadership development as well, which includes the strand of equity, and also, if you're familiar with Dr. Brene Brown's Dare to Lead. So those are a few of the different areas of leadership I do.
Excellent. And then Dr. Gross, could you go next?
Hi, good evening all. Good evening, listening audience. My name is Dr. Tajah Gross. I am the newly appointed Chief Equitable Innovation Officer here at Manor ISD. And as you can imagine, equity is a key lever that permeates throughout the whole entire organization as it relates to expanding great school choice options, looking at hiring practices and how we can become more equitable in the work, providing youngsters high quality access to curriculum. So I'm really excited to be a part of the conversation on today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gross. And then last but not least, I'm going to ask CJ Laguerre to introduce herself. She actually works with me over at Geronimo Consulting, and she's going to be in the background kind of making sure everything is tip-top, ship ready for us today.
Hi, everyone. I'm CJ Laguerre, and I have a virtual assisting and consulting company here in Austin, and I am Dr. Prince's executive assistant and social media manager. So I'm very excited you were all able to join us tonight.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. Well, let's hop into it, because one of the things I mentioned to each of you, and if you had an opportunity to watch Glenn Singleton, and just a little bit about Glenn Singleton is internationally known. He's runs the Pacific Education Group, and our connection here locally to Glenn Singleton and his organization is through his work called Beyond Diversity, and it was really about those courageous conversations about race. And we invited him, Dr. Pierce Burnette, that was been 3-4 years ago now. 3 or 4 years ago, working with the Mayor's Task Force on Institutional Racism to really provide a resource for the community focusing on race equity. And since then, we've had about 3,200 people, I believe, go through the training over the last several years. And this has been in collaboration with other efforts here locally, whether it be the racial healing circles or undoing racism, to really prop up and the voices of Black and Brown people across this community, but also have these conversations about how to have this conversation around racial equity. And so he was the main subject of discussion last week with Mark Updegrove, who is the director of the LBJ Foundation, and who is one, of course, of our collaborators on this event, the path to racial justice, racial equity. And he provided 3 recommendations. And our focus is here, of course, is on education. And that's why each of us are here to have this conversation, because each of the individuals here are really providing their insights as educators or folks who are in the education space. And the 3 recommendations that Lynn Singleton focused on were, number 1, having each person reflect on race in their life, really having that kind of introspection on how does race have an impact on their life, but also seeking other perspectives, because you're only, working only on your own perspective when it comes to issues around race and racism is not enough. It's important to also seek out others' perspectives. And then lastly, acknowledging and addressing your own biases, because there's been a lot of work around implicit bias and other issues. And so I think what he's trying to encourage us to do is really be mindful of how those biases impact the work that we're doing, and really being attentive to those biases as they have them oftentimes a negative impact on our work with young people and in the community. And so I wanted to start off with asking a question that hopefully will be useful for each of us, and hearing your own kind of personal experience and perspective. And if you don't mind, Dr. Gross, if you don't mind going first, the first question I want to ask is, tell us about how you entered into race equity work.
So I think being in education for over 25 years, I think as a school leader, I think that is really where this whole intersection of race really impacted my life. And as a school leader of an alternative high school, particularly where students come there for a number of challenges around homelessness, incarceration, hopelessness, not really having a family to call their own. And so that was really a life-changing event for me as it related to the equity and access for how our students who had these particular life circumstances that some were beyond their control, how it really impacted my life, and how I began to look at the equity lens and really look at how was I as a school leader using my lens of empathy. So my moral compass changed, that deep empathy within me changed. And I know that kind of really changed me with respect to really understanding what I really need to focus on, what mattered the most, and how I could make the most impact personally and professionally to improve the quality of life for young people. And so had I not had that intersection at that age in my life as a school leader, I don't know whether I would have ever really gotten to a place of deep empathy and understanding of how race just really impacted how our young people were getting access to the resources, the funding that we needed to make sure that we had the correct curriculum in place, how we were engaging our school community around just making sure that we had work-based learning opportunities for our young people as they were incarcerated and they were trying to re-enter into our community. And so that was a big part of helping really to get reintroduced in my life at a personal level around the impact of race.
That's really great to hear. And I want to mention that Dr. Gross comes to the Central Texas area from the great city of Baltimore. And so she's going to bring that flavor, that insight, and those perspectives to the young people and her team out there in Manor. So thank you for being here today. Geronimo, do you mind going next? Again, the question is, tell us about how you entered into race equity work.
Sure. Because Dickey, I grew up first generation Mexican-American immigrant. And I remember the spring of 1980 in Washington State, having grown up as a migrant farm worker. And it's the 7th grade. And while I saw my brothers and sisters and cousins all walk from the camp to the bus stop to get the school bus, and when I saw them being picked up by that school bus, but I wasn't on it because I was working full time from the 7th grade to the 12th grade, going to night school 3 times a week, 3 hours a night, and and just feeling the sense of the opportunities of education closing on me. That was my first experience with race, but it wasn't my first experience with equity, as I remember asking my mom and dad about my grandmothers, and both of them never saw the inside of a schoolhouse. And when I was working all day long and being frankly upset that I was in this position, I promised myself that one day I would make sure that people believed that every child could graduate from high school, college, career, and life ready. Those weren't the exact words coming out of a 7th grader in the fields. But a few years ago, I had the opportunity to be appointed to serve on the Austin Independent School District Board of Trustees. And if you fast forward life, I was the first one in my family, not just to graduate high school, but also college and law school. And I felt a need to give back to the public education system that gave me so many opportunities. And so that was my kind of entrance into race and equity. But I do think it's a lifelong journey that you have to have a responsibility and accountability to yourself about what it is that you're doing with your 2 hands in this kind of work. And so that's.
Geronimo, thank you so much for giving that perspective, because I think oftentimes people forget where we come from, and oftentimes they only see the veneer. And so I really appreciate you sharing your background and your family. Dr. Pierce Burnette, you mind going next? And again, the question just for is, tell us about how you entered into this race equity work.
That when you asked that question, I started thinking, where was the beginning? I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. I'm a child of the 60s. So it just became a part of, with Motown being the soundtrack of the civil rights movement. And I grew up in an all-Black neighborhood. I think I went to an all-Black schools from my K-12 experience was all Blacks. Like there was only one white student in my graduating class, Carol Ruzicka. I can't remember yesterday, but I remember her name. So it just has always been a part of who I am. And I think it really became baked into the fabric of my being. And I feel very blessed that my professional life and my professional goals and my personal goals have intersected. I think that's very important because that really gives me the passion behind my work. I'm married to an HBCU graduate, and my son is a graduate of an HBCU, and I got to see, and I am not, and I got to see up close and personal the magic of what these schools do. And I also got to see up close and personal how they have to work extra hard to be respected. And as the president of an HBCU in a city like Austin, quite frankly, the sustainability of my institution to continue to do the magic that it does in young people is dependent on how Austin is perceived across the globe for people to live and work and play and to be educated in. So after I came here and really got to know the history of Austin, and I personally, when I drive around East Austin and I see the remnants of what East Austin, used to look like, and I see it in pictures, it looks exactly like the area that I grew up in. And if I had a historically Black college in my neighborhood, I was raised in, Cleveland is a city of neighborhoods. So if I was raised in the area I was raised in, it looks like it, like just like it. The neighborhood barber shops, the neighborhood beauty shops, barber shops, the businesses, the restaurants, et cetera. So that culture is in me, and I know the magic that it does in the city. And I know that if you don't have racial equity in the city, it will not continue to grow. So it has to be equitable for all. So that's how I got into it so passionately. But I think it's always been just a part of who I am. Growing up, like Geronimo said, first generation. My dad and my mom worked low paying jobs so that my sister and I could do what we do right now. So I feel like I owe them something to be able to make sure that I pave that pathway for others like myself. And I want to take a special moment to thank, welcome Dr. Gross here. I think it's only fair that we took some talent from Baltimore since they took our assistant city manager, Chris Shorter. So I want to personally welcome her and tell her that we're really glad that she's here. So.
Thank you, Dr. Burnette.
Excellent. Thank you for saying that, Dr. Chris Burnett. You know, what you made me reminded me of when I had moved to New York as a young buck. When I remember going to the Bronx as a social worker, one of the first things I experienced was, you know, this is not that different from Fifth Ward Houston. It was a certain affinity that I had, even though it was supposed to be dangerous and all those kind of things. There was a certain affinity I had for someone who was coming from HBCU, Prairie View A&M. So definitely appreciate you sharing that. Dr. Garcia, would you mind kind of, again, and I'll read the question just for everyone. Tell us about how you entered into race equity work.
I journaled like 5 pages of things for each of your questions, because so I won't share all 5 pages, but I think to answer this question, you have to see, like, there's intersectionality of different pieces of my identity that feed the answer to this particular question. And one of them, a big part of it is my mother, I'll say Chingona, and hopefully like I won't get censored. My mother was a Chingona. She was a badass. And I lost my mother to suicide when I was 10. So that event in my life tremendously influenced a lot of who I am. But for 20 years, I was on autopilot, just going through the motions, going through the shoulds of what society, my friends, the guy I was dating, whatever, wanted or expected of me. So I think I know in hindsight places where I experienced and started to lean into race equity work, but I wasn't aware of it at the time. It took me going through my graduate program. I was in my mid-30s, right? So not too long ago. And my dissertation chair, Dr. Miguel Guajardo, I was struggling with, I want to study this, I want to study with that, all the things. And he said, maybe you need to study yourself. And for me, it was like, why would I want to do that? Why would anyone want to do that? And he was brilliant, right? He plants the seed and he's like, okay. 2 weeks later, I'm like, yes, I'm going to study myself. And really unpacking my history, my journey, my own racial identity, which I hadn't really explored. That coupled with, I worked for a national nonprofit as the director of coaching, and I got to design and deliver curriculum about race and equity. And through that process, I took the IAT test, which is Harvard's unconscious bias. That lit a fire for me. Like it gave me a sense of awareness, like, yes, me too, I'm a part of this problem. And then one of the very first times I facilitated equity work, I was in DC, not far from Baltimore. And a gentleman who was a principal of an elementary school happened to be in the room, a Black man. And I was sharing a story from the get-go, and he immediately said, I'm offended. And we hadn't even really gotten to know, like, they didn't get to know me, and I didn't get to know them. And for him to give me that feedback in that moment, while it was hard, it also opened my eyes to how important it is to really lean into the second piece that Glenn Singleton gave us, right? It's important for us to be aware of and listen to other people's perspectives. And that while it was hard to hear that, it grew me so much as a facilitator and an educator, and how important it is to understand a variety of perspectives. It's not just mine.
I appreciate that. It's really valuable. I really like your kind of self-introspection, which is one of the things that Glenn Singleton definitely asks each of us to do, because sometimes we tend to focus on the other when we really need to be kind of exploring ourselves. And so I appreciate that perspective. Elizabeth Dickey, principal over at the Rosedale School. Would you like to go next?
Sure. So I think really when this began to show up and make sense in my life, I was a brand new teacher. I was teaching special education in the high school that I graduated from. And I went to Temple High School down the road, and as a special ed teacher and living in the innards of the school that I had gone to, I saw things that I had never seen as a white young woman, enjoying school, having a great time. I quickly realized that the students with disabilities that I was working with were living really different lives, having very different educational experiences. And I saw that a lot of that was related to race. And I don't think I knew it then, but I think that that's what kind of started this desire to understand why we were treating some students and some families so differently, and why the results that they got, the resources that they were offered were different. And then I moved to Houston. I was in Houston ISD for a number of years. I was an assistant principal at a high school in the Heights in Houston, and again saw things are just not, they're not the same for everybody. And working in special education, I think you have to be a problem solver, and you have to just be dogged to find the solution for students. And I just kept seeing that same obstacle coming up. And I saw that in very different ways, students were routed in certain directions, not given opportunities. And then just the way that disability and race, that intersection, I think is really important to look at, because we can't, well, in my experience, it's really important to look at both of those pieces together and make sure that students are being offered what they need, and that it's not based on who their parents are or the color of their skin, or if they know the right words to say to get the resources.
As I think most of us know, that oftentimes a lot of the reasons why certain students are able to do well is because some parents have a better way of navigating the system. And oftentimes when parents don't have that experience or knowledge to navigate the system, their kids unfortunately suffer. And so it's really difficult for our students, but also for our parents who are trying to navigate a system that's really not built for them to be successful sometimes. And so I guess the next question I want to ask, and I'll ask everyone, we kind of got to the question around how you kind of, or at least I heard a little bit about how you kind of explored race in your life. I want to get to the next question, which is, what have been some blind spots or biases you have actively worked on? Because we've heard a lot of conversation probably in the last 5 or more years about implicit bias and other kind of biases. And I'll speak for myself. One of the biases I had to kind of deal with was I grew up in a household that wasn't really receptive to the LGBT community. And so I had a lot of biases growing up in that space and really had to work hard on that. And so I assume this is something that all of us have struggled with. And I guess I wanted to hear from each of you of a bias that a bias or a blind spot you had to work on. And what maybe some just suggestions of things that you've done to kind of help you work on that. And this with no expectation that you're perfect and you've worked through it all, but really try to get started on that work. And Geronimo, do you mind going first for us?
Sure. I'm being reflective about your question. I think that the one of the blind spots I had when I was younger was, I think, viewing my life or my perspective both as a victim and then also as less than. And I think that one of the things that helped me was both in college, going to St. Edward's University, and also some of the leaders that I met there, is really looking at my life more from a strengths-based perspective and looking at values and what we believe. And I think what that made me do is drop a lot of those kinds of mindsets of well, it changed me to have a mindset of abundance, not one of scarcity. And also to make sure that what I was sharing was really not like, well, this group has it worse than I do, or this group has it, has it less worse than me, but that finding the commonalities around that. And I think one of the experience idea when I was growing up, I was option rule. At the time, on a personal level, I hated that. It really didn't speak about who I am or what. My experience should be the rule and not the exception. Every graduate, school, college, career, life ready. So these words, while they may be some pretty words on a piece of paper, a mission statement for example, Austin ISD, they are really values that we have to hold ourselves accountable to doing. And it's a journey, as you said. You're going to get it wrong some of the times, and you're going to get it right some of the times. But I think it's important to be both reflective and turn the mirrors on ourselves when we do this kind of the blind spots, and also give ourselves some grace as well as we continue to grow as human beings and look at each other as human beings, not something less than the other. Those are, and I could probably go on forever around a lot of these issues, but blind spots and being reflective to me is really a practice that you have to continuously do. It's not like some one day you're magically, now you're equitable, or now you see everything from different perspectives. It is hard, and it is a practice, and we have to continuously hold ourselves accountable to it as well.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And it really speaks to the journey of this work. It's not something you just take a class and you're woke, right? Dr. Pierce Burnette, I'll read the question just again. What have been some blind spots or biases you have actively worked on?
It's a real challenge for me to grasp that everybody doesn't care in the way that I do. Like, I just want people to see that it's the right thing to do. And even most recently, I was in a meeting where we were navigating through writing a letter to legislators, and it was all about equity for young people. And it was all about the business proposition, the economics. So I wanted us to add some narrative in there about, it's just the right thing to do. It's morally right. And someone actually said, they don't care if it's the right thing to do. And that was just like a reality check for me, because that's very real. And as we see now in our nation with the political divides, people are battling. They say the elephants fight and the ants get trampled. People are battling over the different politics as opposed to serving people. And that has been a real challenge for me. And I think my bias in that way is that I make an assumption that people see it as the right thing to do, or that people have the experience, and that's just not the case. And it makes me ineffective sometimes, because then I get passionate and I become the mad Black woman in the room, the angry Black woman in the room, because I'm trying to articulate it in a way that, like, you want to shake someone and say, this is just unfair, or it's unequitable, or can't you see? Is what I think is what Elizabeth was saying a little while ago. You think everybody sees it, but they don't. And that has been truly, and that is my own bias, really, technically, that I believe that everybody thinks like I do. And it's just not, or feels like I do, or has passion like I do. And that I think my passion is right. And that's not always the case. So.
I love how you say it almost very simply. It's like, isn't it just the right thing to do? And a lot of folks just don't see that. It's not, and that's when we have to make the business case for this work and other things. But Dr. Garcia, I love to hear from you. What are some blind spots or biases that you've been actively working on?
Choices, which ones to share. I think one that was really painful to recognize that I had and have to continue to check myself on, it was a bias around the strong accents, quite frankly. I grew up, my grandmother only spoke Spanish, and I can remember translating for her, and we had this like hidden role. She didn't check my Spanish, I didn't check her English, like And we had this way of communicating that it was okay if it wasn't proper. But I remember moments when I would translate for my grandmother, and I was like anywhere between 4 to 10, like little. And here's my elder, my grandmother, and the way that people would look down on her. I could read their judgments of her being less than. And I internalized their looks towards my grandmother as her being unintelligent, her being unvaluable, not as valuable as those of us who could speak English language properly. And that was some tough unpacking to do, to recognize that I had that own belief about my amazing, strong, powerful, I don't know how in the world she managed to pull off all of the things that she pulled off, raising 6 kids on her own. Like, I had to come to terms with and forgive pieces of me who held that belief about my grandmother, and in turn, anyone else I encountered who had a thick accent or didn't speak English properly. Yeah, that's been a big one to check myself on whenever I have the privilege of speaking with someone with a thick accent who speaks multiple languages.
I really appreciate you bringing that up, Liz, because, particularly in the state of Texas, accents is a political, cultural phenomenon that's just, I don't know if we've come to a solution to it yet, but it is something that we're struggling with, I think, as a community. So thank you for that. Elizabeth, again, the question is, what are some blind spots or biases that you've been actively working on?
I also have millions, but I will pick one of the top ones. I think what I've realized working with students with disabilities and their families is that a younger Elizabeth was assuming that she knew what families needed and what the right choice for their student was. When you're talking about students with significant disabilities and thinking about where people are going to live in their future and the kind of job they're going to have, I realized that I was looking at that from a very white perspective, a very this is what independence is independence is important. That's the motto of my school, is independence taught here. That's probably a problem in some ways. And so I think that as I've learned to shut my mouth and listen to families and listen to students talk about their dreams and what a good life looks like, what a meaningful life looks like, it's not something that I would design. It's much better. And so I think I highly recommend shutting up and listening to students and parents, because they are the experts. And I don't want my life designed by somebody else, and I shouldn't be designing somebody else's life.
Powerful. Thank you, Elizabeth. I appreciate your insights. Really listening. Leadership requires it. So, Dr. Gross, any insights you want to share about your blind spots or biases that you've been actively working on?
So I think the older I get and the more wiser I seek to become, I found myself in a place of conformity. And it is something that I am truly, truly working on, because I know that there is a culture in education, right? There is, in some aspects, the go along to get along, right? There were biases that were happening to children. There were inequities right in front of my face that I saw happening to children, right? So we weren't doing things for children for them, we were doing things to them, right? We were putting policies and practices, and things were happening. And in some instances, I sat quiet, and I knew that I had a moral obligation as a school leader, an educator, a central office, and now in the role of a chief. I know that I had a moral obligation. So as I continue to work on myself, I'm really at a place now where I'm just practicing living my truth and speaking my truth. And so the stakes are too high right now with respect to equity and what's happening around the country politically and looking at the political landscape, the stakes are just too high now. And so every chance I get, I want to live and more importantly, speak my truth.
Mm. Speaking the truth, I love that, and I admire your insight that you shared there, Dr. Gross, because that's actually a common thing, particularly people of color struggle with, because the speaking out, speaking your truth has consequences, right? There's negative consequences for seeing things and saying something. And so sometimes we learn, and I know I've had the experience where you don't say anything, and then you figure out, no, I got to say something, and sometimes deal with the consequences. So I appreciate that the insight. I do want to pause just for a second. We're a little bit past the half hour, and I want to encourage folks who are in the audience who are watching this webinar to submit their questions they may have, because we're going to, after this next question, probably approach some questions from the audience. And so if you have any questions that you may have of our panelists today, I encourage you to go to the Q&A tab and click it, and then enter your question that you may have. But I'm going to ask one more question, and I'm gonna ask Dr. Pierce Burnette to respond. She asked me not to let her go first, but technically you're not going first. You're going like the 15th. So this next question is, one of the things we know in the literature, and just maybe from personal experience, that oftentimes many white people are blind to their own race. When we look at the census, the people who oftentimes mark no race or other race are mostly actually white Americans, because they just don't experience themselves as being white. And so the question is, how does that present any challenges, in your opinion, when white Americans don't see their own race or don't see race in those ways?
It goes back to what I was saying about the right thing to do, because you're not affected. You don't feel how you're treated differently because of the color of your skin. You don't recognize your own privilege, just to use that. We toss that around a lot, but that's really true, that in anything, even as a college president, if I don't recognize my own privilege in the position, whatever those privileges are, but if I don't recognize the privilege in the position, then I'm going to act a different way until I see my privilege and how I can have an advantage that someone else on the campus might not have, because they're not in the president's position. So I think that is the challenge, because, and I'm going to mess this up, but Margaret Mead, an anthropologist, has a very famous quote that says something about, until things really won't change until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. So if I'm not affected, I'm not outraged, and we're seeing it unfold, that things are happening to such an elevated level, that now more and more people feel outraged because you see something that's so exaggerated. I mean, the takeover of the Capitol, and then the nation's response to that, as opposed to the protests during the Black Lives Matter. I mean, that's outrageous. So not everybody is outraged, but people who are not normally affected by those kinds of things are now feeling it in a very different way and processing those emotions in a very different way. I mean, and our whole relationship with race in our own lives, I believe, evolves. Just as late as this weekend, my dad, he was born and raised in Mississippi, and he migrated to the North after having an interaction with a white man kicking his mother. So he then moved to, this is back in the 50s, clearly, moved to Ohio. That's where I was born. So, and then now, as a part of this, another whole after show, as a part of the migration, then back to the South, because many Blacks that move from the from the South to the North for opportunity, then end up moving back to the South for opportunity. But he called me this weekend, very concerned, and telling me, he said, don't go anywhere by yourself. And he said, you don't know these people like I do. And it made me so sad that my dad has to have that concern about his grown daughters in 2021 in the United States of America, because of his own experience and almost seeing it mirrored right now. So this concept of race, until we really embrace it, and the whole concept of color blind versus color brave, no one is color blind. We just have to really move into a very, what Glenn Singleton says, a very courageous conversation about race, because I believe in my soul that humanity, everyone wants a better world for their children.
Definitely.
And embracing that whole concept of humanity. You know, they say there's one race, the human race, but accepting the history of why race is such a third rail conversation, and the concept of racism and anti-racism. So.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Pierce Burnette. Dr. Garcia, I'm going to read the question just real quickly. What have been many white people are blind to their own race. Does that present any challenges in your opinion?
Yeah. I being blind to your own race, you're to the same thing that what Dr. Colette Pierce Burnette just said, right? Like, if you aren't outraged, you're not gonna, you're just perpetuating what exists and the privileges that come, white privilege, which that term has such I don't know if trigger is the right word, a reaction from white people that I notice. It's almost as if saying white privilege is equivalent to saying you're racist or you're a member of the KKK. Like, white privilege exists. It wasn't something that any individual chose or any individual created. The system that exists was created long before any of us on this webinar were born. But we're here now, a part of this system, and we are responsible for this system. White people that did not create the system of white privilege, yet they're still benefiting. And it's not as if I'm labeling you as a bad person when we say that white privilege exists. It's out of your control for the most part. It is why a white man or a white woman can get away with saying something that I or anyone, you, Dr. Pierce, you, Dr. Colette Pierce Burnette, could not get away with doing without some severe consequences. The sooner that we can recognize that it's a part of the system, it's the smog that we're all living and breathing, the more likely we can actually make progress and do something about it, so we can live it in a more equitable and just world. But until we can acknowledge that it exists, we can't, all of us, we can't change it for all of us.
Appreciate that, Dr. Garcia. Elizabeth Dickey, same question. Does the blindness to color blindness that some white people experience, does that present any challenges from your perspective?
I mean, I think in our country today, it presents most of the challenges. If you could get rid of that one thing, then we would live in a different country. And I think those being my people, I think the challenge is how to share the understanding that you gain, share your stories in a way that people can hear them. In my experience, a lot of people I guess that's the main way that I see the hardest change happening, is people experiencing something or hearing another person's story and being able to really take it in. But that feels really challenging in a country right now where we aren't willing to, or many white people aren't willing to listen to the stories.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying is that for the dangers that the stories that people need to be sharing, their experiences as a white person, oftentimes they're not being shared, and those stories need to be heard, those perspectives need to be heard if we're going to actually make any progress in our society. And so I really appreciate you sharing that insight. Dr. Gross, I'm gonna have Dr. Gross and Geronimo go, and then we're gonna go to questions from the audience. And same question: do you feel like color blindness presents any challenges in education or in other spaces?
Absolutely. So, when you have the benefit of having your race highlighted as a part of the core curriculum, right? When I turn to books, I can't find my race identified in any of the curriculum, right, that's being taught. I think that's a problem when we talk about the fact that when you have white privilege, right, you have the benefit of having a good relationship with the police, right? When we talk about George Floyd. And so you have the benefit of having a great relationship with the police while we don't. And so I just think when we look at Black and brown children and what's happening with respect to them being incarcerated 2, 3, 4 times um, in the penal system for the same crimes that are likely to be committed by white counterparts. And then when we talk about Black and brown children, particularly in education, being disciplined and suspended 2, 3, 4 times more than their counterparts for the very same thing. And so, yes, it really has put race front and center, right? Race has just become so blatant within the fabric of education. And this is where I think we have the opportunity to kind of like push back and kind of not go with the status quo, right? This is our opportunity right now.
Cool, thank you. And Geronimo, I'm gonna let you go next, and just before that, I'm gonna ask CJ to see if there's any questions in the Q&A as we kind of get ready for the Q&A section. Geronimo, just again, you feel
Yeah.
like color blindness is presenting some challenges?
Definitely, it presents a lot of challenges, but there's also opportunities. And Dr. Gross mentioned something that just made me think. The first book I ever identified with my culture was Bless Me Ultima by Rodolfo Amaya. And it wasn't until later in life that I realized how significant it is for a child to see themselves in a book. And the reason I say is because I think there's opportunities for us as much as there's a challenge. The challenge, yes, there's unconscious bias. And it's sort of, if you've ever traveled and just decided you're going to play a game and say, oh, I'm going to see how many yellow Volkswagens there are. And all of a sudden you start seeing all of them. And I think part of the courageous conversations part is the opportunity, the responsibility for us to raise up these issues and watch our friends and those that we know get conscious about the systemic inequities and the racism that's been here historically. For example, on Austin ISD, it has been historically discriminating before. And I think we have an opportunity, a responsibility, and obligation to break those systems to ensure that we have a much more fair and equitable educational system. And so to me, it's sort of like, yes, there's a challenge to it. And I think we have to raise up those issues and be a part of the solution. And I think that, just from my perspective, I really do believe that power is something that you participate in, not something that you possess, which is, again, another part of this making individuals conscious about the power they have and how they're participating in the impact that it's having in our communities. And we have to raise that up now.
Excellent. I love that. I appreciate that. And what I want to do is I want to transition. We have about 8 minutes, give or take, for Q&A. I'm going to try to get to as many questions as possible. Before we do that, I want to remind people the Central Texas Collective for Racial Equity. We've only been around for a few months, and Dr. Pierce Burnette, she's actually really happy that she's serving as our board chair. And I wanted to make sure to take this opportunity to encourage you to go to our webpage. You should find it in our chat box, and go to the webpage and learn more about the collective. But I also want to encourage you, if you want to support, we're right now in the middle of a campaign, a beloved community campaign, to raise $250,000 to continue the work to diminish and dismantle institutional racism in this community. And so please support us in that effort if you're able to. Any amount makes a difference, and so please do that if you're in a position to do so. But I wanted to ask one of the questions from the Q&A, and this question actually is for you, Elizabeth. This question asks, have you experienced any pushback as a white woman working in this area? And your mic is off. Your mic is off.
Sorry. I'm assuming that is saying pushback related to race and equity work.
That's how I read it.
Okay. I think that in the world of education, we get attached to things, institutions, ways that we've done things. And so I think that when you are pushing people to look at things differently, I have experienced pushback in just trying to begin conversations about what if we looked at this differently. But I have to say I'm in a group of high school principals that I work with, and I'm really happy to be in a group of people that asks each other hard questions and is doing a lot of collective work around this. So I feel really supported in a lot of ways in trying to think about things differently and trying to kind of interrogate from the inside as to what is right, as Dr. Pierce Burnette said.
Cool. Thank you for sharing that. Another question comes from one of our audience members, and the question, I'll read it, is given the true discrimination and prejudice poor white people are experiencing at the intersection of race and poverty, how can the issue of systemic racism be framed so poor white people can see it? And the way I think about that question is oftentimes when poor white people come across this conversation on race, oftentimes they feel like, well, I struggle, I have a hard time. How am I, why should I be worried about racism when I'm having the same struggles as Black and brown people may have? And so I don't know if anyone wanted to tackle that question. How do we get poor white people to see it, this systemic racism? Anyone want to get on that one?
I can share an experience that stands out for me. Was working with two professors from Harvard, Liz City and Irvin Scott, and Irvin Scott was sharing some data from a campus and just asking people, like, what do you notice about this data? And digging into like by race, subject, like scores, and people were sharing a few different things. And after a while, there was this clear indication of, in the data, it was better to be, and when I say better to be, I'm talking about scores. You performed better if you were a poor white, no, if you were a, I'm gonna get this wrong. If you were a poor white student than if you are in the wealthy area of a Black student, right? So you would perform better if you were a poor white kid than if you were a wealthy Black kid from that data. And that for me is a like clear indicator about the discrepancies that exist in many ways in our education, especially by race.
Those discrepancies about success and how people do on tests. I mean, I think you're making a really good observation. Oftentimes we see these disparities where you can be a poor white person and still get higher income, better job opportunities, higher, just different kinds of experiences of success, despite being compared to someone who's of color, who is highly educated, coming from a more wealthy, affluent background, and still being outperformed by someone who's poor and white. So I really appreciate you providing insight. Anyone else want to kind of get on this one? How do you make this case for folks who are poor whites and frame the conversation so they see it and understand? Are there other things?
I would just highlight that Dr. King actually started coming off the heels of celebrating his life. He actually his whole thing was about poverty and fighting poverty and how it was detrimental to society in general. And then of course it's hard to untangle the two together. But in those conversations, when we talk just about addressing poverty, and our conversation today is educators, and education is the great equalizer, and sharing that the more you can become educated, the more opportunities you have. Is completing high school, going on to some post-secondary education opportunities. So it's coming at it from that angle, as opposed to coming at it from the angle of you're different because you're poor and white, so you stand over there and wait your turn. Because it's really about poverty. At the end of the day, it's about equitable opportunities that are not afforded, and poverty is generally the worst enemy in that respect. So like Dr. Garcia said, the data speaks for itself, that race does then compound the problem, but at the root of it is the issue of poverty. And looking at a country that we do some very basic things, from minimum wage, et cetera, looking at minimum wage, et cetera, you know, irrespective of your race.
I'm going to try to slide in one more question and see if anyone wants to kind of piggyback on it. And this one is from one of our audience members. Says, given the insurrection we all witnessed at the Capitol last week and the recent damaging attempts to rewrite history in the U.S. Regarding slavery, what role will educators play to appropriately influence future leaders to understand and seek truth? It's a really broad question, but I wanted to see if anyone wanted to tackle that one.
As a part of the conversation as we move forward, particularly many of the conversations that I know I've been engaging in now more than ever is the restorative justice practices. So as we begin to kind of talk about what's happening right now, this is such a great time in education for us to begin to look at how do we restore the harm that has been caused generation by generation. And the only way we can do that is to begin that restorative practice work. And so I know that we are really digging in deep so that we can really begin to introduce a course around introduction to racial equity, right? Because we all have to own it, right? We all have to own our implicit biases, where we come in and how our biases impact how students learn and their academic performance, and how we've all been a part, right, of the harm systemically as a district, right? And on a personal level, how do we engage our scholars now around restoring the harm that has been caused? So the work that we have to do around restorative circles is really important. Students who haven't been engaged in school, the work that we're doing around re-entry circles, so that students have a school that is a part of a community that cares, and really changing the culture of what that looks like. So that's really a lot of the direction in education that I believe is going to benefit our children.
Oh, that was really great, Dr. Gross. Anyone else want to get in before we wrap things up? Anyone else want to get in? Anything that we might want to do? Geronimo?
You know, the other thing I might add to what excellent points on Dr. Gross's part is the idea that we need to be advocating for more Black studies programs, curriculum in schools, Mexican American studies. If we don't know where we come from and what has happened, how do we expect to change both ourselves and the systems we're a part of? And I think that's so important to make sure, and educators play such a role in that. And I'll tell you too, because one of the things I wish that teachers could take every single student through the National African American Museum, starting at the bottom, with a history of slaves and moving them through ships, and getting a really incredible sense of the responsibility that we have treated each other as less than humans. And then moving forward from there. That was a profound experience that I hope that as many Americans as many individuals as can go through that.
And I would just really like to emphasize that in addition to the students, that the teachers and the administrators, you know, so that we're teaching an accurate history is super important. So I'm just really add to what our board chair and all these other hats he has is saying.
Excellent. And I want to make sure my friend Emily Lee, she did a good point of making sure to also include our Asian American and other communities who also need to be studied in our work, because we're all represented and need some education in that space. But with that, I want to say thank you to Dr. Liz Garcia, Principal Elizabeth Dickey, Dr. Colette Pierce-Burnette from Houston Tillotson, our president board of the Austin ISD, Geronimo Rodriguez, and our newly shined Chief Equitable Innovation Officer over at Manor ISD, Dr. Tajah Gross, over in Manor. And I just want to say thank you to each of you for being here today. It's been a joy to be with each of you. Good to be just having this conversation. I do want to let everyone know that next week we'll be responding to Dr. Peniel Joseph over at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, who will talk about how did we get here in the first place. That will be the subject that will be discussed this Thursday, and we'll be coming together next week, same time, Tuesday, the 26th at 6 o'clock, responding to this conversation about how do we get here. And we'll actually have Dr. Kevin Coakley from UT and also Dr. Richard Radick and other guests to have that discussion next week. So please be here next week, same time, same bat channel. And thank you again to our panelists and to our audience, and I'll see you next week. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, KP. I have to say hi to my dad. He's never been on a webinar. Hi, Dad. I love you.
Hey, Dad. Cool, sweet.
Bye, y'all.
Great.
All right, take care,
Yeah.
y'all.
Thank you.
Take care.